Hello and welcome. My name is Timothy J. Miller, and this is episode 3 of the Chronic Pain Survival Guide podcast.
Our drug policy has really been traditionally based on racism and moralizing. The reason that the currently illegal drugs are illegal has nothing to do with a scientific evaluation of the relative risks and benefits. Otherwise, you could never come up with a situation where marijuana is illegal and tobacco is legal.
For episode 3 of this introductory series, we are looking at the Harrison Anti-Narcotic Act of 1914. Once passed, the act created a cultural rift that forever changed the interpersonal experience between doctors, pharmacists, and chronic pain patients. I want to get through the remaining historical and political content quickly so we can move on to the standard format of this show. But first, there are things we must cover because the fight ahead of us is monumental. The best thing we can do is arm ourselves with knowledge that can be shared with other chronic pain patients. There is no way to change the narrative in this country by continuing to suffer in silence. In fact, our conditioning to do so, to suffer in silence, has only bolstered the war against us. Many chronic pain patients fear their doctors. For example, I endured 8 failed neurostimulator implants with a 9th painful spinal surgery scheduled. Thankfully, my primary care doctor came to my rescue after the 8th post-operative exam. As she examined my back, she exclaimed in shock, "My God, Tim, they're treating you like a human cutting board." Through tears, I replied, "I know what they're doing to me. CU Medical is treating me like a lab rat. But any resistance from me carries with it the potential to irritate the doctors, get me fired from their practice, or worse, have accusations of drug-seeking behavior in my medical records." In addition, chronic pain patients fear the pharmacist when they fill a prescription for pain medicine. Each time, their doctor can be overridden by a pharmacist who has far less education and 0 pain management experience. Therefore, their pain meds can be denied by a pharmacist at any point, and then cold turkey withdrawals are on the horizon. Think about that for a second. We have this bastardized narrative by the federal government that is freely repeated by the media with no fact-checking. The chronic pain patients who can speak up and counter the narrative have been bullied from the moment they became chronic pain patients. People like myself have suffered in silence for several decades. The resistance to the narrative that doctors created the opioid epidemic and that pain patients just need to toughen up and take an aspirin has been minimal. Now granted, there has been some pushback from the medical community, but most medical professionals are happy to go with the flow. When I was out of state in August of 2018, I ran out of some of my medications. I went to the emergency department for a refill on my Lyrica, which isn't even an opioid, it's an anticonvulsant, and my blood pressure medication. The doctor said, "If you had shingles, I would happily refill the prescription, but you take Lyrica for chronic pain. The federal government has made it illegal to treat chronic pain in the ER. I can only refill your BP meds." I walked out of the hospital stunned, and shortly thereafter, I went through cold turkey withdrawals from Lyrica, which was absolute hell. Don't doctors tell us to never stop taking a medication cold turkey due to the dangers involved? Well, I guess that only matters when one isn't a second-class citizen, aka a chronic pain patient. It is really hard not to feel bullied in this environment. Pain clinics across the country are closing their doors, and the few pain management doctors who are still practicing are inundated with new patient requests. This is extremely problematic because according to the Henry Ford Health System, chronic pain patients outnumber pain management doctors nearly 30,000 to 1. That was the ratio of chronic pain patients to pain specialists that was discovered in a 2011 study. I don't even want to know what the ratios look like today. Folks, the time has come for us to expose the faulty statistics, the flaws in logic, and the abuses of power by those spreading the misinformed, hateful, and discriminatory narrative that is circulating today. Speaking up isn't enough. We have to destroy the false narrative in this country with facts. We need to bring clarity to the conversation and stop the association of pain medication with the drugs that are the true cause of the opioid epidemic: heroin and illicit fentanyl. The truth of the matter is the illegal drug supply in this country has been poisoned. It's poisoned with illicit fentanyl, and that is why overdoses are soaring at a rate of 45% per year. The huge problem we face is the fact that the chronic pain stigma has been reinforced in America's culture for generations upon generations. It was alive and well in 1995 when I was catastrophically injured. The good news is that the numbers are on our side. The CDC estimates there are 50 million chronic pain patients in America. The bad news is that the chronic pain community is not united. But that can change. Okay, before we get started, there's some quick housekeeping to do. Visit us on social media. On Facebook at facebook.com/The Chronic Pain Survival Guide. On Twitter at A Chronic Pain Pod. On Spreaker.com, visit SPREAKER.com and search the site's podcasts for the keywords chronic pain. And visit us on Patreon at patreon.com/chronic pain. There's a lot to cover in this episode, so let's move on to the main content of the show. A brief history of opioids and opioids in America. The name opium comes from the Greek word opion, meaning poppy juice. The earliest reference to opium growth and use is in 3400 BC, when the opium poppy was cultivated in Lower Mesopotamia. The art of poppy culling, culling, poppy culling, was popular among the Sumerians, who then passed it on to the Assyrians. The process involved scoring poppy seed pods with surgical quality iron blades in order to extract opium. From the Assyrians, the method was passed on to the Egyptians. Now, the alkaloids of opium, morphine, codeine, thebaine, and the vasodilator papaverine, remained a mystery until morphine was discovered thousands of years later. Morphine was the first opium alkaloid isolated. The derivative was discovered by Friedrich Serturner in 1805. Nearly 70 years later, in 1874, English researcher C.R. Wright first synthesized heroin by boiling morphine over a stove. The discovery of the more potent drug was initially lauded as a non-addictive cure for morphine addiction. Because it can pass rapidly through the blood-brain barrier, heroin is far more potent than morphine, though its effects do not last as long. Opium and opium-based products were widely available at drugstores, local stores, and other common places in the late 19th century. Due to the public's ignorance about the addictive properties of opium and opium-based products, by the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were 250,000 opium-addicted Americans. Mattie Blaylock, the second wife of famed lawman and gunfighter Wyatt Earp, died from alcohol and laudanum poisoning in 1888. The Progressive Era and the War on Drugs. The United States Congress, in its earliest law enforcement legislation on narcotics, imposed a tax on opium and morphine in 1890. Tabloids owned by William Randolph Hearst published stories of white women being seduced by opium-dealing Chinese men. The articles were used to invoke a public fear of the quote-unquote yellow peril, which was simply racism disguised as an anti-drug campaign. By 1903, morphine addiction rose to alarming rates in America. Congress banned opium in 1905, and the following year passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required labeling of contents on all medicines. When the public was made aware of the dangers of opium and its derivatives, the labeling requirements helped cut the sales of opium products drastically. According to the Smithsonian Magazine website, on January 4, 2018, the federal government's efforts to ban opium grew out of its new colonialist ambitions in the Pacific. The Philippines were a territory under American control, and the opium trade there raised significant concerns. President Theodore Roosevelt called for an international opium commission to meet in Shanghai at the urging of alarmed American missionaries stationed in the region. Quote, U.S. delegates, wrote Carolyn Jean Acker in her book, Creating the American Junkie, were in a poor position to advocate reform elsewhere when their own country lacked national legislation regarding the opium trade. Secretary of State Elihu Root submitted a draft bill to Congress that would ban the import of opium prepared for smoking and punish possession of it with up to 2 years in prison. Quote, since smoking opium was identified with Chinese, gamblers, and prostitutes, Professor of History David T. Courtwright wrote, little opposition was anticipated. The law banning opium, passed in February 1909, limited supply and drove prices up. The first time the federal government criminalized the non-medical use of otherwise legal drugs was the Harrison Anti-Narcotic Act of 1914. The act was also vehemently supported by prohibitionists and the Anti-Saloon League, a group with uncomfortably close ties to the Ku Klux Klan. Speaking of prohibition, the ratification of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution came with countless unforeseen consequences and was therefore repealed in 1933. Prohibition gave rise to bootlegging and the Italian Mafia. Just to put things into perspective,
so, just how rich was Al Capone? The net worth of this crime boss is projected by Celebrity.money to have been over $100 million, more than $1.3 billion nowadays. The larger part of his wealth derived from his criminal activities during Prohibition. It has been estimated that by 1929, Capone's profits from the diverse sources of his business included over $60 million from selling illegal alcohol, $25 million from gambling, and over $15 million from racketeering. It was believed that Capone had over 600 mobsters to keep his business safe from other gangs.
the prohibition of alcohol created a massive crime empire. The Italian Mafia became part of American culture. And even today in 2019, we are watching John Gotti's wife and children on reality television. The Harrison Act also came with countless unforeseen consequences. According to Professor Ronald T. Libby, professor of political science and public administration at the University of North Florida, in a 2005 policy analysis, Section 2 of the Harrison Act made it illegal for any physician or druggist to prescribe narcotics to an addict, effectively turning 250,000 drug-addicted citizens and their doctors into criminals. By 1916, 124,000 physicians, 47,000 druggists, 37,000 dentists, 11,000 veterinarians, and 1,600 manufacturers, wholesalers, and importers had registered with the Treasury Department as required by the Harrison Act. Almost as soon as they had registered, hundreds of doctors were arrested and prosecuted for prescribing narcotics to addicted patients. During the first 14 years of the Act, U.S. attorneys prosecuted more than 77,000 people, mostly medical professionals, for violating the Act. Between 1914 and 1938, about 25,000 doctors were arrested under the terms of the Harrison Act for giving narcotic prescriptions to addicts. Many medical professionals were eventually put on trial, and most lost their reputations, careers, and/or life savings. By 1928, the average sentence for a violation of the Harrison Act was 1 year and 10 months in prison. More than 19% of all federal prisoners were incarcerated for narcotics offenses. Clinics closed down, and physicians had little choice but to abandon thousands of addicted patients. A black market for narcotics soon arose. Over 19% of federal prisoners were jailed for narcotics offenses in 1928. Today, 46% of federal prisoners are imprisoned for drug-related offenses, and drugs are still flooding into this country and destroying entire communities. According to the Pacific Standard magazine on January 2, 2015, the public health motivations behind the Harrison Act were murky at best. By contrast, the very first national drug regulation law, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, required products to disclose their ingredients and was clearly designed to protect consumers.